December 3rd, 1945, 6:14 in the morning, New York Harbor. The pier smelled of three things Margaret Albrecht would remember for the rest of her life. Salt water that had traveled 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, diesel fuel, leaking from idling truck engines, and the particular metallic scent of cold that settles into wood and metal and human skin when winter decides to make itself known. The wooden planks beneath her feet were slick with overnight mist that had condensed into something between water and ice. Each board creaked differently when weight shifted across it. She had been standing in the same spot for 47 minutes and had learned the specific groan of the plank directly under her right heel. Her fingers wrapped around a government-issue clipboard with a steel backing had gone numb 23 minutes ago. She did not move to warm them, did not shift her weight, did not do anything that might be interpreted as weakness or hesitation or second thought. She simply stood and waited and tried not to think about what was coming. Behind her, the city of New York was beginning its daily resurrection. Delivery trucks rattled down West Street, their engines coughing blue exhaust into the gray morning. A ferry horn sounded somewhere in the fog-thick harbor. The note, low and mournful, answered by another ferry somewhere to the south. The sound carried strangely in the cold air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Gulls wheeled overhead in lazy circles, crying their harsh territorial songs to one another, arguing over scraps that had not yet appeared. The dawn light was thin and colorless, the kind of light that makes everything look like it exists in an old photograph. Maggie was 28 years old, though she felt considerably older. She had been born in Munich, Germany, in a third-floor apartment that overlooked the Isar River. She could still remember the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, how they would start with St. Peter and then spread across the city like ripples on water. She remembered the taste of her grandmother's apple strudel, the way the cinnamon would stick to the roof of her mouth. She remembered the feel of her mother's hand, small, strong, calloused from years of housework, as they walked to the Viktualienmarkt together on Saturday mornings. She remembered all of this in German, in the language that had been her first and only tongue until she was 10 years old. That was 1938, the year everything changed. The year her father, a university professor who taught medieval history and wore wire-rimmed glasses that were always sliding down his nose, had looked at the newspaper one morning. She remembered it was a Tuesday, early September. The coffee had gone cold in his cup, and said quietly to her mother, "We have to send the children away now, while we still can, while the borders are still open." Maggie and her older brother Nathaniel had sailed to America 3 weeks later on a cramped steamship called the St. Louis, packed with other German children whose parents had seen what was coming and made the hardest choice parents can make. Their grandmother was too ill to travel, bedridden with the cancer that would kill her 14 months later. Someone had to stay with her. Someone had to take care of the apartment, the books, the life they had built. Their parents promised to follow within 6 months. As soon as grandmother passed, as soon as they could get the papers in order, as soon as it was safe. They never did. The letters had come regularly at first, once a week, then once a month, then every 6 weeks, then sporadically, like a heartbeat growing fainter. The last letter had arrived in August of 1943, forwarded through the Red Cross mail system, the envelope so thin you could see the writing through it. After that, silence. 2 years and 4 months of silence, broken only by official Red Cross notifications stamped with bureaucratic language that meant nothing and everything, unable to locate. Search continuing. Status unknown. Please contact this office if you receive any information. Yesterday had been Nathaniel's birthday, December 2nd. He would have turned 24 years old. Would have. The conditional tense, the grammar of the dead, the language you use when someone exists only in past and possibility, never in present or future. First Lieutenant Nathaniel Albrecht, United States Army, killed in action. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. The telegram had arrived 9 days after his death, delivered by a boy who could not have been more than 16. who had stood on the doorstep of the boarding house in Brooklyn where Maggie lived and could not meet her eyes as he handed over the yellow paper. The telegram had used the word regret. The War Department regrets to inform you. As if regret were something that could be quantified and delivered. As if regret could reconstruct a body blown apart by German machine gun fire. As if regret could bring back a brother. They had not sent Nathaniel home. He was buried somewhere in France in a temporary military cemetery near Colleville-sur-Mer that would someday become permanent. Someday become a place where tourists would visit and take photographs and try to feel appropriately solemn. Maggie had never seen his grave, would probably never see it. He had been 22 years old when he died, would have turned 23 6 months later in December. Would have turned 24 yesterday. Now she stood on a pier in the city that had raised her from a frightened 10-year-old German girl into a competent 28-year-old American woman, and she waited for the men who had killed him. The USS General Meigs materialized out of the fog like something being conjured by a particularly pessimistic magician. One moment there was only gray mist over gray water, and the next there was a ship-gray hull streaked with rust-gray superstructure rising into gray sky. The whole thing looking like it had been purpose-built to depress the human spirit. The ship's engines made a deep thrumming sound that Maggie felt in her chest and sternum, before she actually heard it with her ears, a vibration that seemed to bypass normal sensory channels and go straight to the bones. On the deck, barely visible through the thinning mist, figures moved. Men in gray uniforms, 60 of them, German generals. The highest-ranking prisoners of war captured in the European theater of operations. They were being brought to America for interrogation, for psychological evaluation, for the intelligence officers to try to understand in the careful dissecting way of intelligence officers. How an entire nation had been led into darkness. How ordinary men who ate breakfast and complained about the weather and loved their children had become architects of industrial-scale atrocity. How the machinery of genocide had been designed and implemented by people who probably considered themselves patriots serving their country. And Margaret Albrecht, who spoke German like a native because she was a native who understood not just the language but the culture and the references and the particular way that Bavarians structured their sentences differently than Prussians would translate their words. Would sit in small rooms with artificial light and take their statements and render them into English. Would be the bridge between their reality and American understanding. She was here because she spoke German flawlessly, because her accent was Bavarian cultured, the kind that came from good schools and good families and Sunday afternoons at the Staatsoper, because the United States government needed someone who could not only translate words but understand implications, catch references, hear what was being said beneath what was being said. Because she was good at her job, methodical and precise and able to separate emotion from function. She was here because she had volunteered, had walked into the Red Cross office in Brooklyn and said, "I speak German. I can help. Use me." She was here because somewhere in the fog and diesel and morning cold, beneath all the practical reasons and professional justifications, she needed to look into the face of the enemy and understand what her brother had died fighting. Needed to see if they were monsters or men or something in between. Needed to know if Nathaniel's death had meant something, or if it was just another piece of meat fed into the grinding machine of history. Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright stood 3 feet to her left, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the wool of his uniform and the particular scent of the pomade he used to keep his hair in regulation order. He was 45 years old, career military, with silver threading through dark hair. He kept regulations short, even though regulations had relaxed somewhat now that the war was over. He had fought in the first war, the one they had thought would be the last war, the war to end all wars. How naive that seemed now, and had come back to fight in the second. There was a photograph on his desk at Fort Hunt in a simple wooden frame, a young man in uniform smiling, standing in front of what looked like the Roman Colosseum. His son Robert, killed at Anzio January 22, 1944, 20 years old. The photograph had been taken 2 days before he died. Maggie and Colonel Wainwright had never spoken about their dead. There was no need. Grief recognized grief the way wolves recognize other wolves, by scent, by posture, by the particular weight that settles into the shoulders and never quite leaves. "You ready for this, Miss Albrecht?" Wainwright's voice was quiet, barely audible over the water lapping against the pier pilings and the rumble of the ship's engines. He did not look at her when he spoke, keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. Maggie did not look at him either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ship sliding toward the dock with the slow inevitability of continental drift. "No, sir, but I don't think readiness is required, only presence." Wainwright made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been recognition, or might have been simply acknowledgement that some things cannot be prepared for, only endured. He did not elaborate. The ship docked with a groan of protesting metal against wood. The sound was enormous, violent, the kind of noise that made your teeth hurt. Thick rope lines were thrown from the deck to the pier, caught by longshoremen who had been doing this work for 30 years and could catch a rope in complete darkness wrapped around bollards with practiced efficiency. The gangway descended with a mechanical shriek of hinges that desperately needed oil metal scraping against metal in a way that set the nerves on edge. And then they came. 60 men in Wehrmacht gray. The uniforms stripped of all insignia and rank markers, but not of their essential character, not of the particular cut and quality that spoke of military tailoring and regulations that governed everything down to the angle of a collar. They moved stiffly, legs adjusting to solid ground after 14 days at sea, bodies that had grown accustomed to the constant motion of a ship now having to recalibrate to the terrible stability of land. Some were young, barely into their 40s, with the kind of fitness that came from years of active command. Others were old, white-haired, and stooped men who had somehow fought in 2 world wars and survived them both, though survived was perhaps too optimistic a word for what they looked like now. All of them, young and old, fit and broken, wore the same expression: disbelief. They stared past Maggie, past the dock, past the immediate reality of their arrival at the Manhattan skyline rising from the harbor like something from a fever dream. Glass and steel towers climbing into a pale winter sky. Buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. The Chrysler Building catching the weak morning light, its Art Deco crown gleaming. The Empire State Building standing like a monument to some god of vertical ambition. Intact, undamaged, gleaming. Not a single broken window visible from this distance. Not a crater, not a pile of rubble. Not a skeletal wall standing alone where a building used to be. One man near the front of the formation stopped walking entirely. He stood frozen halfway down the gangway, mouth slightly open, staring at the skyline the way someone might stare at a ghost. The men behind him bumped into his back, momentum carrying them forward. Some muttered irritated words in German, but the man remained motionless, transfixed. Maggie followed his gaze to the familiar landscape. She had lived in New York for 7 years now. The skyline was ordinary to her, expected. She saw it every day and thought nothing of it, the way you stop seeing your own face in the mirror after a certain age. She forgot sometimes what it looked like to someone seeing it for the first time. Forgot that most of Europe was rubble now. That Berlin and Hamburg and Munich and Dresden were cities that existed primarily as names on maps, the physical reality of them reduced to hollow walls and collapsed roofs and streets that were more crater than road. But here Manhattan stood whole, defiant, completely untouched by the war that had consumed the rest of the world. "Sie haben gelogen," the frozen man whispered in German, his voice carrying in the cold morning air with surprising clarity. "They lied to us, about everything." The words hung there for a moment. Several other generals turned to look at him, then back at the skyline, then at each other. The disbelief on their faces deepened into something more complicated. Confusion, anger, fear, the beginning of understanding that everything they had been told might have been a lie. Maggie's pen hovered over her clipboard. She did not write the words down, not yet. This was not official testimony. This was not something that needed to be recorded and analyzed and filed away in intelligence reports. This was simply shock, made audible. The sound of certainty dying, The generals were herded, there was no other word for it, they were herded like cattle into a rough formation on the wooden pier. American soldiers surrounded them in a loose perimeter, M1 rifles held at a casual rest position. Not threatening, not exactly, but present, visible. A reminder that despite the polite words and the formal procedures, these men were prisoners, defeated, captured, subject to the will of their captors. A photographer moved through the crowd, a speed graphic camera hanging from a strap around his neck. Flashbulbs popping in rapid succession, the sudden white light making the prisoners blink and flinch. Pop, pop, pop. Each flash preserving this moment for posterity, for newspapers, for the official record of the United States government. Receiving the defeated representatives of the Third Reich, reporters scribbled notes in narrow notebooks with pencils they had to keep licking to make work in the cold. Their breath steamed in the December air. They shouted questions in English that the Germans probably could not understand and would not answer if they could. The prisoners stood in their rough formation waiting for whatever came next with the resigned patience of men who had already lost everything that could be taken and so had nothing left to fear. Some raised their hands instinctively to shield their eyes from the flashbulbs. Others simply stood staring straight ahead, faces carefully blank. Colonel Wainwright stepped forward, moving to the front of the formation. He removed his cap in a gesture that was formal rather than friendly, holding it against his chest. The gesture was calculated, respectful enough to satisfy the requirements of the Geneva Convention, but not so respectful as to suggest equality or forgiveness. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the pier with the practiced projection of a career officer accustomed to making himself heard over artillery fire and aircraft engines and all the other noise of war. "Welcome to the United States of America. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated in accordance with those rules without exception. Is there anyone here who requires immediate medical attention?" He paused, waited, let the silence stretch. Maggie translated his words into German, her voice steady and clear and utterly professional. The generals turned to look at her, a ripple of attention moving through the formation. Some with surprise, a woman young, speaking their language with the soft vowels and slight singing quality of Munich German. Some with calculation, who was she? What was her role? Could she be useful or manipulated? Some with simple exhaustion, it did not matter who she was. Nothing mattered anymore. No one indicated they needed medical care. Several men coughed. One was clearly favoring his left leg, but no one spoke. Wainwright nodded once, sharp and economical. "Very well. You will now be processed. This will include identification, verification, inventory of personal property, and initial health screening. Your cooperation will make this process proceed quickly. Resistance will make it proceed slowly. The outcome will be the same, regardless of your choice." Maggie translated again word for word, her German as precise as her English. She had made sure of that. Had practiced until there was no trace of American influence in her accent, until she sounded exactly like someone who had never left Munich. Language was power, translation was control. She would not give these men the satisfaction of correcting her grammar or questioning her fluency. One man near the back of the formation, tall and broad-shouldered, with an Iron Cross medal still somehow pinned to his collar, despite regulations requiring all decorations to be removed, sneered openly. "Hollywood propaganda," he said in German, loud enough for most of the formation to hear. "Papier-mâché buildings built as a stage set for the defeated. Theater to demoralize us. They want us to believe they are strong when their whole country is built on Jewish money and Negro labor and the theft of other nations' resources." Maggie's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She knew this man's name from the roster she had spent the last 3 days memorizing. General Wilhelm Krieger, Waffen-SS, 48 years old, born in Stuttgart, educated at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin. Former commander of Einsatzgruppen operations in Poland and Ukraine from 1941 to 1943. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units. They did not fight soldiers. They executed civilians. Primarily Jews, but also Roma communists, intellectuals, priests, anyone the regime deemed undesirable. Women and children shot into mass graves they had been forced to dig themselves. Entire villages erased in an afternoon. Krieger had overseen the deaths of somewhere between 15 and 30,000 people, depending on which intelligence report you believed. And he stood here on an American dock under an American sky, calling American power a Jewish conspiracy. Maggie translated his words without inflection, without editorial comment. Her voice as flat and professional as if she were reading a grocery list. This was her job, to translate, not to judge, to convert German words into English meaning regardless of what those words were. Colonel Wainwright looked at Krieger for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something hardened in his eyes, something cold and patient and dangerous. "General Krieger," he said, slowly pausing after each word to let Maggie translate. "You are welcome to test the solidity of our buildings. Touch them. Strike them with your fist if you wish. We have nothing to hide, unlike some." The implication hung in the cold December air, obvious and unavoidable. "Unlike you. Unlike the regime you served, unlike the lies you swallowed and the atrocities you committed and the mass graves you filled. Unlike the hollow words and empty promises and industrial-scale murder dressed up as patriotic duty." Krieger's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been hanging loose at his sides, clenched slowly into fists. The knuckles went white. But he said nothing more. The iron cross on his collar caught the light. The processing began. Long wooden tables had been set up in a nearby warehouse, the kind of temporary infrastructure the American military could conjure anywhere in the world within a few hours. Tables, chairs, lights, forms in triplicate. Each general was called forward by name, rank, and serial number from a master list. Identity was verified against prisoner manifests and photographs taken during initial capture. Belongings were searched methodically. Pockets turned out, bags opened, seams examined. Personal effects were cataloged on official forms with carbon paper that made your fingers dirty. Everything recorded, everything documented, everything done by the book. Maggie stood beside the inspection table, translating the questions and answers that flowed back and forth in the flat, efficient rhythm of military bureaucracy. Name, rank, unit, home city, next of kin, medical conditions, religious affiliation. Most of the exchanges were brief. The generals answered with varying degrees of cooperation, some sullen and monosyllabic, others almost eager to comply, a few maintaining a dignified silence that suggested they were above such petty requirements. Then came Friedrich von Hartmann. "General Friedrich Wilhelm von Hartmann," the processing officer called, reading from his list. A man stepped forward from the waiting group. He was 52 years old, according to the manifest Maggie had memorized. Average height, maybe 5'9". Medium build, though clearly he had lost significant weight recently. His uniform hung loose on his frame in a way that suggested it had once fit properly. Graying hair, cut military short, the kind of haircut you could maintain yourself with scissors and a mirror and no particular skill. His face was lined deeply, the kind of lines that came from years of squinting into too many horizons or from grief that had nowhere else to go but into the flesh. His eyes were gray, tired, old. "General von Hartmann," the processing officer said, his voice neutral and professional. "Please place all personal items on the table." Von Hartmann complied without hesitation, without comment, without the subtle resistance some of the others had shown. He moved with the mechanical precision of someone performing a familiar ritual, someone who had done this before and knew the steps and saw no point in resistance. From his pockets, a white handkerchief frayed at the edges, yellowed with age and washing. A stub of pencil worn down to maybe 3 inches, the kind you had to hold awkwardly to write with. A small leather wallet cracked with age, the stitching coming loose in one corner. The officer opened the wallet, methodically checking each compartment with practiced efficiency. Inside identification papers, Wehrmacht issued the photograph showing a younger version of the man standing before them. A few marks of German currency, worthless now that the Reichsmark had collapsed and the occupation forces had implemented new scrip. Stamps that had never been used, a scrap of paper with what looked like an address written in pencil, and tucked into a small inner pocket folded once to fit a photograph. It slipped out as the officer unfolded the wallet completely, making sure there was nothing hidden in the lining. Fell face up on the wooden table with a soft sound that should not have been audible over the general noise of processing, but somehow was. A boy, 12 years old, maybe 13, blonde hair neatly combed, parted on the left. Blue eyes, you could tell even in the black and white photograph that they were blue. Somehow the camera had captured that quality. Smiling. The kind of open, uncomplicated smile that belonged to someone who had not yet learned that the world could break you, that the people you loved could die, that happiness was temporary and safety was an illusion and nothing good lasted forever. He wore what looked like a school uniform. Behind him, slightly out of focus, a Christmas tree with candles. On the back of the photograph, in neat handwriting that looked like it had been done with a fountain pen, Hans, December 1944. Von Hartmann's hand shot out, fast, desperate, a reflexive grab that spoke of panic rather than thought. He snatched the photograph back from the table, pressed it against his chest with both hands, holding it there as if it might escape if he loosened his grip even slightly. For a moment no one spoke. The warehouse noise, other prisoners being processed, guards talking, the shuffle of feet on concrete seemed to recede into distant background static. Maggie stared at von Hartmann, at the way his fingers trembled where they pressed the photograph against his uniform, at the way his face had gone suddenly naked, all the careful military composure stripped away to reveal something raw and wounded underneath. At the present tense in the inscription. Hans, not in memory of Hans, not my son Hans died 1945. Just Hans, December 1944. A label, a moment preserved, the boy in the photograph, Hans. Christmas 1944, less than a year ago, 13 months. Where was he now? Why did von Hartmann carry his picture like a talisman against disaster? Why did he hold it with shaking hands as if it were the only thing between him and complete dissolution? Family? The processing officer asked, his voice gentle in a way that suggested he had his own photographs tucked away somewhere. Von Hartmann's voice came out barely above a whisper. My son. Present tense. Not was my son. Not I had a son. My son is present existing. Maggie translated the question and answer, but she already understood. In the tremor of his hands, in the way he could not bear to let the photograph rest on the table for even a moment, in the present tense that refused to acknowledge what past tense would mean. The officer made a note on his form, nodded. You may keep the photograph, General. We do not confiscate family pictures. Von Hartmann carefully, reverently slid the picture back into his wallet, closed the leather with his thumbs, the gesture slow and deliberate. Tucked the wallet into his breast pocket, the left side over his heart where it would rest against his chest when he breathed. He gathered his other belongings, the handkerchief, the pencil, the worthless currency, and moved through the rest of processing like an automaton, answered questions in a monotone, submitted to the medical screening without comment, allowed his photograph to be taken without flinching at the flash. Maggie watched him walk away when processing was complete, watched the careful way he kept his left hand pressed against his breast pocket as if checking that the wallet was still there, that it had not somehow disappeared, that the photograph was safe. She looked down at her clipboard, found his name in the roster she had memorized. Next to his name in neat typewritten letters, Commander 352nd Infantry Division, Normandy Sector, France. Defensive Operations, June 15, 1944. The blood drained from Maggie's face. Normandy, June 1944, Omaha Beach. Nathaniel had died on Omaha Beach. June 6, 1944. First wave, 0630 hours. Dead by 0700 according to the preliminary casualty reports she had requested and read and memorized, even though everyone told her she should not. That it would not help, that knowing the details would make it worse. This man, This General Friedrich von Hartmann with his trembling hands and his photograph of a blond boy named Hans. This man who wore his grief so openly he might as well have been bleeding. This man had commanded the defenses that killed her brother, the coastal artillery that had turned the Sund red, the machine gun nests that had cut down waves of American soldiers as they struggled through surf and barbed wire and obstacles specifically designed to slow them down and make them vulnerable, the mortars that had rained shells on the landing craft and turned the water itself into a killing ground. Nathaniel had been in the first wave. Second lieutenant leading a platoon had made it maybe 40 yards up the beach according to the report. Maybe. No one was certain. The officer who reported his death had been 200 yards away and had seen the platoon go down, but could not confirm individual casualties until later after the beach was secured, after they could actually walk the sand without being cut down. And the man who had given the orders to fire stood 30 feet away, walking toward the convoy trucks, one hand pressed against his breast pocket where he kept a photograph of his son. Maggie's hands shook. She set down her clipboard carefully, slowly, before she dropped it. Colonel Wainwright appeared at her elbow, seeming to materialize out of the organized chaos of processing. "You all right, Miss Albrecht?" She could not answer immediately, could not make her throat work, could not push words past the sudden constriction. Wainwright followed her gaze, saw von Hartmann being led toward the waiting trucks with a group of other processed prisoners. "You read his file." Not a question, a statement. "Yes, sir." And he commanded the Normandy sector, the 352nd Infantry Division. June of 44, where my brother died. Wainwright was quiet for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, "Do you need to be reassigned?" Maggie looked at him. At this man who had lost his own son and still showed up every morning to do the work, to treat prisoners with dignity even when they deserved none, to maintain the thin, fragile structures of civilization in the aftermath of barbarism, to be professional when being professional was the last thing anyone wanted. "No, sir," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to stay." "Why?" "Because I need to understand. Understand how a man who loves his son enough to carry his photograph over his heart could give the order to kill someone else's son. How those two things exist in the same person." Wainwright nodded slowly. He did not offer platitudes, did not say it would be all right or that time would make it easier or any of the other useless things people say when they do not know what to say. He simply nodded. "That," he said quietly, "is the question we're all trying to answer." Then he walked away, leaving Maggie standing beside the processing table with her clipboard and her shaking hands and her hatred that was suddenly much more complicated than it had been an hour ago. Continuing to Part 2 due to length. This is approximately 4,000 words for Part 1. Should I continue with Parts 2 and 3 at the same length? Each will be 4,000 words to reach the total 12,000 words. The interviews began on December 5th, 2 days after the generals arrived at Fort Hunt. Colonel Wainwright had converted 3 rooms in the administration building into what he carefully called interview spaces, never interrogation rooms. The distinction mattered. Each room had windows letting in natural light, comfortable chairs instead of metal stools, a small table between interviewer and subject, and always coffee offered at the start of each session. Real American coffee, not the acorn and chicory mixture the Germans had been drinking for years. Maggie sat in interview room 2 beside Colonel Wainwright. A notepad lay open in her lap, pen ready. She would translate every word and record anything of intelligence value. The first 3 interviews were routine. A logistics officer discussed supply chain management with mechanical precision. An artillery commander wept when asked about family. His wife killed in the Dresden firebombing, his son missing on the Eastern Front. A third prisoner, one of Krieger's hardliners, refused to speak at all. Sat with arms crossed for 15 minutes before being dismissed. The 4th interview changed everything. December 8th, Tuesday afternoon, 1400 hours. Friedrich von Hartmann entered the room. He wore the standard khaki uniform issued to all prisoners, American military surplus, with a large black P stenciled across the back. But he carried himself as if still wearing Wehrmacht gray with all its insignia. He sat without being asked, folded his hands on the table, and waited. "General von Hartmann," Wainwright said, "thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I'd like to discuss your command in Normandy, specifically the defensive preparations from April through early June of 1944. Your cooperation would be valuable." Maggie translated, her voice steady despite sitting 3 feet from the man whose orders had killed Nathaniel. Von Hartmann nodded once. "What would you like to know?" Wainwright pushed a blank sheet of paper across the table, a pencil beside it. "Draw it for me, the defenses, as you remember them." Von Hartmann picked up the pencil. His hand hovered over the paper for a moment. Then he began to draw. The coastline emerged in quick, confident strokes. The curve of the Norman coast, gun emplacements marked with small circles, infantry positions as rectangles, tank barriers as crossed lines, minefields as scattered dots. His hand moved with absolute certainty, with muscle memory. But when his pencil reached a certain section of beach, it slowed, stopped. His hand began to tremble. Maggie looked at the map, at the place where his hand had frozen, Omaha Beach. Von Hartmann set down the pencil, pressed his palm flat against the paper, closed his eyes, breathed deeply through his nose. The room fell silent. "June 6th, he said quietly, eyes still closed. "We knew they were coming. Intelligence reports, weather patterns suggested delay. The storm was severe. We hoped it would stop them, but they came anyway, through impossible weather, through seas that should have turned them back." He opened his eyes, looked directly at Maggie. "I stood in a bunker above that beach. Wider Stands Nest 62. I watched them land, saw the ramps drop. Thousands of them. Boys most. Younger than my son. They came in waves and we fired, and they fell, and more came and we fired again, and still they came. For hours the sand turned dark, the tide carried bodies out and brought them in again, and they kept coming." He picked up the pencil, his hand steady now, completed the map, added the final defensive positions, the overlapping kill zones. "I gave the order to fire. I could have ordered retreat. We knew by mid-morning the invasion was larger than we could stop, that reinforcements would not arrive in time. But I followed duty, my oath, and thousands died before they touched dry land." He pushed the completed map across the table. "Is there anything else you need today, Colonel?" Wainwright studied the map. Extraordinary detail. Genuine intelligence freely given. "Not today, General. Thank you." Von Hartmann stood, nodded to them both, turned toward the door. "General," Maggie heard herself speak. He paused, turned back, waited. She had meant to demand something, an explanation, an apology, some acknowledgement of Nathaniel specifically. But the words would not come. Her throat closed around them. Von Hartmann waited patiently. When she said nothing, he nodded once more. Left. The door closed softly. Maggie stared at her notepad. The page was blank. She had forgotten to write anything. "You all right, Miss Albrecht?" Wainwright asked. She could not answer. Wainwright picked up the map. "He gave us accurate intelligence without pressure, without asking for anything. That's unusual." "Maybe he's trying to earn favorable treatment," Maggie said. "Maybe, or maybe he's just tired of lying." The days after that developed a rhythm. Mornings were for interviews, 3 or 4 per day. Some productive, yielding intelligence about Wehrmacht command structure and tactical doctrine. Others ending quickly when prisoners refused to speak. Afternoons, the generals were assigned work. Simple maintenance tasks, raking leaves, clearing brush from the perimeter, sorting supplies, repairing equipment, work that kept hands busy and minds occupied. Maggie watched them adapt. Some seemed relieved to have structure again. Others moved through tasks with barely concealed resentment. Krieger's 15 hardliners initially refused to work, were placed in isolation, then offered the same assignments again until they either complied or were transferred. Von Hartmann was assigned to the grounds crew. Every afternoon, Maggie would see him somewhere along the camp perimeter, working alone or occasionally with one or two others who seemed to gravitate toward him despite Krieger's warnings about collaboration. On December 10th, a Tuesday afternoon, cold enough that breath steamed in the air, Maggie saw him doing something different. He was digging in an unused corner near the eastern barracks, using a small garden spade to excavate a hole about 2 feet deep and 18 inches across. He worked steadily, methodically, his movements economical. When he finished, he retrieved something from his coat pocket. A sapling wrapped in burlap, an oak tree perhaps 18 inches tall, thin as a pencil, roots bound with twine. He unwrapped the roots with extraordinary care, mixed what looked like kitchen compost into the soil at the bottom of the hole, settled the sapling into position with gentle precision, adjusting it until it stood perfectly vertical, filled in the dirt around the roots, patting it firm with his palms, then watered it from his canteen, the water darkening the soil. When finished, he stood and looked at the small tree for a long moment. His hand reached out, slowly touched one of the thin branches. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent. Then he turned and walked away without looking back, without marking the spot, without any explanation. After he'd gone, Maggie approached the sapling, crouched beside it. The ground around it was damp, freshly turned darker than the surrounding soil. There was no marker, no sign, but she understood. This was how a man who had destroyed tried to create. One small tree in enemy soil, planted by hands that had once directed artillery fire, for reasons he did not explain and probably could not articulate. She touched the thin trunk, then stood and walked away. In the camp kitchen, Mrs. Delphine Grayson prepared 3 meals a day for 112 people, 60 prisoners, 30 guards, 22 administrative staff. She worked from 5 in the morning until 8 at night with 2 rotating assistants. She was 54 years old, a widow since the influenza epidemic of 1918. Her only child, a son named Thomas, had enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942. He had completed pilot training, was assigned to the 8th Air Force based in England, flew B-17 bombers. On his 23rd mission, October 1944, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Bavaria. The plane broke apart. 3 crew members died. 6 parachuted out, were captured. Thomas was alive. The Red Cross had confirmed it. Second Lieutenant Thomas Grayson, prisoner of war, Stalag 7. Near Moosburg, Bavaria. No more information than that, just the bare fact that he breathed. And every day Mrs. Delphine Grayson cooked meals for German prisoners. Maggie found her in the kitchen one afternoon in mid-December. The air was thick with steam and the smell of roasting chicken. Enormous pots of potatoes boiled, carrots were being chopped with rhythmic precision. Mrs. Grayson, the older woman looked up. Her face was lined with years of work and worry, but her eyes were kind. Miss Albrecht, what can I do for you, dear? I was reviewing the meal reports. The portions seemed larger than standard Army ration allocations, not by much, but consistently enough to notice. Mrs. Grayson's hands stilled on the knife. She set it down, looked at Maggie directly. My Thomas is in Germany somewhere. Bavaria, they tell me. Moosburg, I don't know exactly where within the camp. Don't know what conditions are like. Don't know if he's eating. Don't know if the people holding him see a boy who needs food or just see an enemy who deserves whatever he gets. She picked up the knife, resumed chopping. I can't feed my son. I can't put a plate in front of him. I can't send care packages. They don't get through, the Red Cross says. I can't do anything for my own child. The carrots fell into neat pieces. But I can feed someone else's son. I can look at these German boys, because some are boys barely 20, and I can give them extra bread, a second helping of potatoes, an apple. And maybe somewhere in Germany someone is looking at my Thomas and seeing a boy instead of an enemy. Maybe someone is giving him extra soup, a piece of bread, something to help him survive. She slid the carrots into the pot. Maybe not. Maybe I'm being foolish. Maybe no one in Germany gives a damn about one American pilot, but I have to believe in maybe. Otherwise, what's the point? If we all become monsters, then what did we win? She stirred the pot. Besides, most of these men didn't choose this war any more than our boys did. They got drafted. got sent where they were told, followed orders because that's what soldiers do. They just had the terrible luck to be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. That's tragedy, not villainy. There's a difference. Maggie left the kitchen without responding, walked outside into December cold that bit through her coat. Wrong side of history. On December 17th, a Monday morning, Colonel Wainwright announced an educational excursion. 8 prisoners selected for cooperative behavior would travel to Alona, Iowa for 4 days. The stated purpose was observation of American agricultural and industrial capacity. The list of names was posted. Von Hartmann's name appeared fourth. Krieger's name was conspicuously absent. That evening, just after dinner, Maggie was working late when she heard shouting from the barracks. She ran toward the sound. A crowd had gathered in the yard, perhaps 40 men forming a circle. In the center stood Krieger and von Hartmann. Guards were moving in but taking their time, following Wainwright's orders to let prisoners resolve their own conflicts when possible. "You sell yourself to them like a whore," Krieger shouted, his face red with fury. "You sit in their rooms and draw your maps and answer their questions like a trained dog. Sit, speak, roll over, you disgrace everything we fought for." Von Hartmann stood with hands at his sides, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. He did not respond. "We were soldiers," Krieger continued, voice rising. "We fought for something greater than ourselves. We believed we sacrificed everything for the fatherland, and now you betray all of it, all of us, all the men who died. You betray their memory because the enemy feeds you hot meals and speaks politely." Von Hartmann's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, calm. "What we believed in was a lie." The entire yard went silent. Krieger's face went purple. His hand moved fast, vicious, a fist aimed at von Hartmann's face. But von Hartmann was faster. He caught Krieger's wrist mid-swing, twisted it, used the man's momentum against him. Krieger stumbled off balance. Von Hartmann released him immediately, stepped back, created distance. Guards surged in, separated them. Krieger was still shouting, struggling. Von Hartmann allowed himself to be led toward isolation without resistance. Maggie stood in the shadows and counted. 15 men had moved to stand behind Krieger. 15 true believers, but 45 had not. The split was complete, visible, and growing wider. The train to Iowa departed on the morning of December 18th from Union Station in Washington, D.C. 8 German generals, 4 American officers, including Wainwright, and 1 translator boarded a civilian passenger train heading west. Maggie went with them. Wainwright had requested her presence as translator, but she suspected he also wanted her to witness what he saw. That transformation required exposure to truth too overwhelming to deny. They rode west through Maryland, Pennsylvania, into Ohio. The countryside unrolled past the windows. Farm after farm, town after town, infrastructure intact, bridges standing, rail lines functioning, evidence of a nation that had fought a global war without having that war fought on its own soil. Von Hartmann sat alone near the back of the car. He had been released from isolation that morning after the standard 72 hours. He had said nothing about the fight with Krieger. Maggie found herself sitting across the aisle from him. For the first hour, neither spoke. "In Germany," von Hartmann finally said, his voice quiet, "the trains don't run anymore. Not reliably. The tracks are bombed, sections missing for kilometers, bridges destroyed, stations are ruins. You cannot travel from Berlin to Munich by train anymore. The whole country is frozen, paralyzed." He looked out the window. "Here everything works. The trains run on schedule. The bridges stand as if the war happened somewhere else." "It did," Maggie said. He turned to her. "Your parents. The Red Cross letter. Did you open it?" "Not yet. I'm supposed to wait until Christmas Eve." Von Hartmann nodded. "I requested information about my sister through the Red Cross. She lived in Munich. I had not heard from her since the Hamburg firebombing in July '43. The records apparently cross-referenced. They found that my sister Greta was alive, working as a nurse at the Munich displaced persons camp. In that cross-referencing, they discovered another inquiry, someone with the surname Albrecht, formerly Schmidt, residents of Munich. Colonel Wainwright was informed of the potential match. Maggie went very still. "You..." The search that found my parents. That was because of your inquiry. The Red Cross did the work. I simply asked a question about my own family. They happened to find 2 families instead of 1. But he had initiated it, had set in motion the process that might mean her parents were alive. Why? Von Hartmann looked back out the window. Because some families should not be torn apart by war, even if mine already has been. The photograph. Hans, December 1944, present tense. The train carried them west through the afternoon, into Indiana, into Illinois, through landscape that looked peaceful and prosperous. They arrived in Alona, Iowa, as dusk fell on December 19th, a small town, population 3,000, Main Street lined with brick storefronts, a movie theater, a hardware store, a diner, the smell of wood smoke and cold earth and grain. The generals climbed down onto the platform, stood staring. This was enemy territory, but it looked like peace made solid. A man approached across the platform, tall, weathered, work-roughened hands. "Colonel Wainwright, good to see you again, sir." They shook hands. "Gentlemen, this is Mr. Henry Caldwell. He owns the grain operation we'll be touring tomorrow. Tonight his wife Eleanor has invited us to dinner at their home." The Caldwell farm sat 2 miles outside town. White clapboard farmhouse, red barn, fields stretching to the horizon harvested now covered in thin snow. Smoke rose from the chimney. Light glowed in windows. As they approached, Maggie could smell food, roasting meat, fresh bread, cinnamon and spice. Inside the house was warm, clean, comfortable. A woman emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on an apron, perhaps 52 years old, gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a bun, lines around her eyes and mouth. "Welcome," she said simply. "Please make yourselves comfortable. Dinner will be ready soon." The dining room table had been extended to its full length. 13 place settings, real china, cloth napkins. In the center, a roasted turkey, golden brown, surrounded by dishes. Mashed potatoes, gravy, corn, green beans, cranberry sauce, biscuits, apple pie cooling on the sideboard. The generals sat slowly, carefully. This was more food than they had seen in years, more than their families in Germany would see in months. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell began to serve, moving around the table, placing turkey on each plate, spooning potatoes, ladling gravy. When she reached von Hartmann, she paused, set down the serving spoon, looked at him directly. "My son David died at Normandy," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "June 6th, 1944. He was 20 years old, a corporal in the 29th Infantry Division. Colonel Wainwright tells me you commanded the German defensive sector where my son was killed." The table went absolutely silent. Von Hartmann set down his fork, began to stand. "Mrs. Caldwell, Sit down, General," she said. Not harsh, not angry, but absolute authority. He sat. She picked up the serving spoon, placed a generous portion of turkey on his plate, larger than anyone else's, added potatoes, gravy, corn, cranberries, more food than one person could eat. "I could hate you," she said, still serving. "Lord knows I wanted to. For 2 years I have wanted someone to blame, someone to focus all the anger and grief on, someone whose face I could imagine when I wake at 3 in the morning and David's room is empty." She moved to the next chair. "But David didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life consumed by hate. He died because he believed something, believed this country was worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that." She continued around the table. "And part of what he died to preserve, part of what makes this country worth the price is that we don't become the thing we fought against. We don't let hate consume us. We don't reduce people to enemies who deserve whatever they get." She finished serving, returned to her place. "So you sit at my table, General von Hartmann. You eat food my son will never eat, and maybe you learn something about why we won. Not because we had more guns, but because we have something deeper. We have the capacity to see the enemy as human, even when it costs everything." She looked at her husband. "Henry, would you say grace?" Mr. Caldwell spoke a simple prayer. Thanks for food, for peace, for the men who returned and those who did not, for strength to forgive, for wisdom to choose the future over the past. When he finished, they ate. Von Hartmann cut his turkey into small pieces, chewed slowly, swallowed with visible difficulty, as if kindness were harder to digest than cruelty. After dinner, Maggie stepped outside onto the porch. She needed air. The night was brutally cold, stars scattered thick across the sky. The Milky Way visible as a luminous band. She heard footsteps. Von Hartmann stood in the doorway. They stood together in silence, looking up at the stars. How can she do that? Von Hartmann's voice was barely a whisper. How can she feed me? Sit at the same table, choose to show mercy? She doesn't forgive you, Maggie said. She chooses the future over the past. There's a difference. I don't deserve it. No, you don't. That's exactly why it matters. If you deserved mercy, it wouldn't be mercy. It would just be payment. Von Hartmann looked away from the stars. In Hamburg, my son Hans died in a bombing raid. February of this year, American bombs, B-17s, Tuesday afternoon, clear weather, perfect visibility. He and his mother were supposed to have evacuated. But my mother was dying. Pneumonia. Someone had to care for her, so they stayed. His voice remained steady. The bombs fell at 1300 hours. Hans was walking home from the market. My wife had sent him to buy bread. My mother loved that bread. Hans was carrying a loaf when the bombs fell. They found him 3 hours later when the fires cooled, in the street, still holding the bread. Maggie felt something crack in her chest. The men who dropped those bombs did not know Hans, did not know he played violin, that he collected rocks and labeled them in a notebook, that he wanted to be an engineer who built bridges. They saw coordinates, target Hamburg, and they did their duty. He turned to Maggie. Your brother, Nathaniel. I did not know him either. I saw enemy forces, a beach to defend, duty, and I gave the command to fire. Tears ran down Maggie's face. We are the same, Von Hartmann said quietly. We both lost someone to duty, to the machinery that grinds up children and calls it necessary. We are not the same, Maggie said, voice shaking. Nathaniel was fighting against evil, against a regime that sent my son to school under swastika flags. Von Hartmann interrupted. That taught him Jews were subhuman, that poisoned his mind from childhood. Hans was a child born in the wrong place to the wrong parents, but still a child. Maggie wanted to argue, to insist there was a moral difference, but she could not find the words. Von Hartmann reached into his coat, drew out the photograph. Hans, December 44, smiling. The people who killed my son, I cannot ask for forgiveness. I will never know their names, but I can honor Hans by refusing to become the hate that killed him. By choosing to see that the enemy bleeds the same, grieves the same, loves the same. He held the photograph toward Maggie. She took it with shaking hands. Looked at the boy, blonde hair, blue eyes, the smile that trusted the world. She thought of Nathaniel, of Hans, of David Caldwell, of Thomas Grayson, all the sons. This is what war does, force the living to carry the dead forever. She handed it back. They returned to the house, to warmth and light, to the strange suspended peace of former enemies sharing space without violence. But outside the night remained cold, and the dead remained dead, and forgiveness remained the hardest work in the world. The convoy returned to Fort Hunt on December 21st, 3 days before Christmas. The generals were quieter on the return journey. Something had shifted, not conversion, not surrender, but a crack in the certainty that had sustained them. Maggie sat in the same seat as the journey out, Von Hartmann across from her. Between them now existed an understanding that had not been there 5 days ago. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but recognition of shared humanity. 3 days until Christmas. 3 days until she would open the envelope. 3 days until truth. Fort Hunt looked different when they returned, though nothing physical had changed. The barracks were the same. The fence was the same. But something intangible had shifted. The other prisoners gathered to hear about Iowa, about American farms that could feed the world, about civilians who treated enemies with hospitality. Krager and his 15 listened with contempt. Propaganda, they said, performance, lies. But the other 45 listened differently, with curiosity, with doubt, with the beginning of understanding that perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. That night, Maggie sat in her office, the envelope on her desk, unopened, waiting 3 more days. She could wait 3 more days. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent, covering the camp, covering the oak tree von Hartmann had planted, covering the ground where enemies slept under the same sky, covering the world that was learning slowly and painfully how to be at peace. Christmas was coming, and with it truth, whatever form it took. Christmas Eve arrived draped in fresh snow that had fallen silently through the night, transforming Fort Hunt into something that looked almost peaceful. The barracks roofs wore thick white caps. The guard towers looked softer somehow. Even the fence posts had become irregular pillars of white. Maggie woke before dawn. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the envelope sitting on her desk. The envelope she was finally allowed to open today. The envelope that would tell her whether her parents were alive or dead. She sat at her desk as pale winter light filtered through the frost-patterned window. The envelope lay exactly where Colonel Wainwright had placed it 3 weeks ago. Red Cross markings, official stamps, her name typed across the front. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945, the day she would know. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, broke the seal, drew out the contents carefully. 2 photographs slid out first, a letter on Red Cross letterhead, and a smaller sealed envelope. The first photograph showed 2 people standing outside a building with a sign in German Münchner Lager for displaced persons. Munich Displaced Persons Camp, her mother and father. She knew them instantly despite the changes. Her mother's hair completely gray, her father gaunt clothes hanging loose. But they were standing, upright, alive. The date stamped on the back, October 15th, 1945, 2 months ago. They had been alive 2 months ago. The second photograph was a group shot, her parents with 3 others, and in the background, slightly out of focus, a man in Wehrmacht uniform, just the uniform visible. But the shoulder boards of a general unmistakable. The letter was typed on official Red Cross letterhead, Miss Margaret Albrecht. Through systematic cross-referencing of prisoner of war mail inquiry, with displaced persons registration records, we have located your parents Joseph and Anna Albrecht, formerly registered under your mother's maiden name Schmidt. The cross-referencing was initiated when General Friedrich von Hartmann requested information about his sister Greta von Hartmann, nurse, Munich resident. The records overlap led to identification of your parents. They are alive and currently residing at Munich Displaced Persons Camp. They are in reasonably good health given circumstances. They have been informed of your location. They request you write immediately. Maggie read it 3 times, each impossible fact. Alive. Her parents were alive, and von Hartmann, again. His inquiry had led to finding them. The smaller envelope bore her mother's handwriting, shakier than Maggie remembered, but unmistakably hers. Across the front, für Margaret, mit aller Liebe. For Margaret, with all our love. Maggie broke the seal. Inside a single page of thin paper. Writing covered both sides. My dearest Maggie, we are alive. We are together. We think of you every hour. We pray you are safe. We pray you will forgive us for not coming to America as promised. Your grandmother died in November 39. We tried to leave after, but borders closed. War began. Everything changed. Your father was arrested in April 41 for refusing to join the party. They held him 8 months. When released, we went into hiding. Friends risked everything to hide us. We lost everything, the apartment, the books, everything, but we survived. And now there is hope. The Red Cross says emigration to America might be possible, or perhaps you could visit. We do not dare hope too much, but we hope anyway. Maggie, my darling girl, we love you. Come home when you can, or don't if America is better. But be happy, please be happy. That is all we want. Your loving mother, Anna. Your father sends his love. He cannot write. His hands shake from the detention years. But he loves you. We both love you. Always. Maggie pressed the letter to her chest, rocked forward, made a sound half sob, half laugh. Alive. After 2 years of silence, after 2 years of preparing for the worst, they were alive. She sat with the letter for a long time, reading it again and again, memorizing every word, every tremor where emotion had made her mother's hand shake. Then she stood, dressed warmly, went outside. The camp was quiet, most prisoners still asleep. Guards moving with holiday shift slowness. Somewhere a radio played Christmas music. Silent night drifting across snow. Maggie walked to the eastern barracks, to the oak tree von Hartmann had planted 2 weeks ago. It stood about 3 feet tall, thin, but alive, small green buds visible despite snow on its trunk. She touched it, felt rough bark beneath her glove, felt the solidity, living wood, growing. And she made a decision. That evening, Fort Hunt held a Christmas service. Voluntary, non-denominational, a chaplain from a nearby church led prayers. Maggie translated into German. All 60 generals attended, some from faith, others from habit. A few simply because there was nothing else to do on Christmas Eve. The chapel had been decorated, pine branches along windows, paper chains from rafters, a wooden cross on a table. Candles filling the space with warm light. After prayers, there was music. Someone had donated a piano, an old upright, worn and scratched, but tuned. Von Hartmann was asked to play. Multiple people asked until he could not refuse without insult. He stood reluctantly, walked to the piano, sat on the bench, adjusted his position, placed his hands on the keys, paused, eyes closed. Then he began to play. Beethoven, Symphony No. 9, the Ode to Joy, simplified for piano, the fingering awkward in places, the tempo slower than it should be, but still unmistakably beautiful. Still the transcendent cry of humanity insisting on joy even in darkness. The music filled the chapel, notes rising and falling like breath. The melody everyone recognized, the universal anthem. Maggie stood in the back watching von Hartmann's fingers move across keys, watching the men's faces. Some wept openly, others sat with eyes closed, all absolutely still. When the music ended, silence held for a long, sacred moment. Then von Hartmann stood, bowed slightly, walked away from the piano. Maggie followed him outside. He stood in snow, looking at the sky where stars appeared, snowflakes caught in his hair. "Thank you," Maggie said quietly, "for the music, for making something beautiful." He turned. It seemed appropriate, for this day, for the end of a terrible year, for hope that next year might be different. Maggie stepped closer. "I opened the envelope. My parents are alive." Von Hartmann's face transformed relief so profound it erased years. "I am so very glad. The letter said you were there, in Munich, October, when the photograph was taken. Yes, they allowed me 30 minutes to see my sister Greta. She works as a nurse at the displaced persons camp. Your mother had developed an infection, minor but dangerous in those conditions. My sister was treating her. You spoke to my parents. I did. I told them I was being transported to America, that I might see their daughter. Your father asked if I would carry a message." Von Hartmann withdrew a small folded paper, worn soft from 2 months of carrying, handed it to Maggie. She unfolded it carefully. Her mother's handwriting. "Maggie, we are alive. We love you. We will always love you. Come home when you can, or don't if America is better. But be happy. That is all we want. Your loving Mama and Papa." The same message, the same desperate love, carried across an ocean by a man who owed her nothing. "Why didn't you give this to me sooner? Because you were not ready. You saw me as the enemy. If I had given it, then you would have refused it. You needed time to see me as something other than monster. Thank you for carrying this, for keeping it safe." Von Hartmann started to turn. "Wait, tell me about Hans. Not how he died, how he lived." Von Hartmann stood very still, snow falling, then spoke. "He played violin, not well but enthusiastically. He would practice scales until my wife threatened to hide the instrument. He loved mathematics, could calculate in his head faster than I could write. He collected rocks, ordinary ones, but each was special to him. He labeled them with location and date in a catalog. He had 247 rocks when he died. His voice caught. He cleared his throat. He wanted to be an engineer, build bridges, connect places. He said the world needed more connections and fewer walls. This was 1943. He was 12 years old, already wiser than his father. Maggie listened, building a picture of a boy she would never meet. Nathaniel loved baseball. He was terrible at it. Could not hit, could not throw. But he loved it anyway. He would listen to games on the radio, memorize statistics. He wanted to be a sports writer. They stood together, trading memories of the dead. Then Colonel Wainwright appeared at the chapel door. "Miss Albrecht, I need to see you, now." His tone was wrong, too formal. Maggie followed him to his office. Von Hartmann came too unbidden but not stopped. Wainwright closed the door, pulled a thick file from his desk. Classified markings covered the front in red stamps. "What I'm about to show you is not public knowledge, may never be. It's been classified to protect morale, to protect families, to protect the Navy's reputation. But you have a right to know." He opened the file, pushed it across the desk. "Inside combat reports, naval artillery logs, casualty lists, after-action analyses, maps with coordinates marked in red." Maggie read. Read it once quickly, then again slowly, making sure she understood. Then looked up at Wainwright, her face drained of color. "No, this is wrong. This has to be wrong. I'm sorry. It's verified by 3 independent sources and confirmed by naval records." Maggie looked back at the file, at the impossible truth. First Lieutenant Nathaniel Albrecht, killed June 6, 1944, 07:12 hours, Omaha Beach. Grid coordinates marked. Cause of death: friendly fire. Naval artillery, USS Texas. Fire support mission. Coordinates miscalculated by 400 meters. Shells fell short, landed on American positions on the beach instead of German fortifications. 17 American soldiers killed, 43 wounded. Nathaniel Albrecht was one of the 17. Not German guns. American guns. The room tilted. Maggie gripped the desk. Von Hartmann moved closer, steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why lie about it?" "Morale," Wainwright said quietly. "We couldn't tell families their sons were killed by American weapons. Not during the war, not when we needed people to keep believing, keep supporting the effort. The truth would have been devastating, so we classified it, attributed casualties to enemy fire. So you let us hate the enemy for something they didn't do." "Yes." Maggie looked at Von Hartmann, at the man she had blamed for 2 years. "You knew something was wrong when you drew that map, when your hand stopped at Omaha Beach." Von Hartmann shook his head. "I knew the numbers didn't align. American casualties were higher than our rate of fire could account for. But I assumed chaos, the fog of war. I did not know American artillery had struck American forces. But you let me blame you. What was I to say? I gave the order to fire on that beach. Whether my guns killed your brother or not, I am responsible for thousands of deaths. What is one more name to carry?" Maggie sat heavily. The file lay open, proof that her grief had been aimed at the wrong target, that the simple narrative she had clung to was a lie. "What do I do with this?" Neither man answered. Because there was no answer, she closed the file. "Who else knows? The officers involved, the Navy, War Department, it's classified, will remain so for years, probably decades. And the families will never know unless something leaks." Maggie stood. "Thank you for telling me." She walked out into the Christmas Eve night. Von Hartmann followed. They walked to the oak tree, stood beneath its bare branches. "I'm sorry," Von Hartmann said, "for what happened to your brother. For all of it. You didn't kill him. No, but the war did. The war we all built, the decisions we all made. We all carry blood." Maggie looked at him. "What do we do now? How do we live with this?" Von Hartmann looked at the oak tree. We plant trees, we play music, we tell the truth when we can, we choose mercy when we cannot, and we hope that maybe someday the world we build will be better than the one we destroyed. Is that enough? It has to be. 2 days after Christmas at 0300 hours, an alarm shattered the night. Escape attempt. Krieger and 3 others. They had cut through the fence and run. They were caught 200 yards out. Someone had informed there would be a tribunal, court-martial proceedings. Von Hartmann was called to testify on December 28th. Maggie sat in the hearing room translating, watching von Hartmann take the oath, watching him describe Krieger's plans in careful detail. He told us we were still at war, that surrender was temporary, that our duty was to resist by any means available, to escape if possible, to maintain absolute loyalty to the fatherland above all else. And what was your response? The presiding officer asked. Von Hartmann looked directly at Krieger, who sat glaring with hatred. I said the fatherland we swore to serve no longer exists, that it died when we allowed it to become an engine of genocide, and that I would not dishonor the dead German and Allied both. By pretending their deaths meant something noble, they died for a lie. The least we can do is stop lying. Krieger lunged, tried to reach von Hartmann. Guards restrained him. Traitor, Krieger screamed in German. You betray everything. Von Hartmann's expression did not change. I was loyal to an idea that did not deserve loyalty. I believed in a cause that was evil. I will not compound those sins by continuing to serve a lie. The tribunal ended with Krieger sentenced to transfer to maximum security. The other 3 separated, sent to different camps. 15 men defended Krieger, 45 did not. Spring came slowly to Virginia. The oak tree grew, adding an inch a week. New prisoners arrived. Old ones departed, repatriated to a Germany that barely existed. In June of 1946, orders came all remaining prisoners would be repatriated by end of August. The war had been over for more than a year. Time for everyone to go home. Von Hartmann was scheduled to leave July 15th. Maggie made her decision in early July. She would return to Germany for 6 months, reunite with her parents, help them navigate the displaced persons system, apply for emigration to the United States, then return to America. This was her home now, but she needed to see them. On July 14th, the day before von Hartmann's departure, Maggie found him tending the oak tree one last time. It stood nearly 4 feet tall, leaves green and healthy. She handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside, wool gloves hand-knitted in dark gray, a note pinned to them. These were made by my mother. She sent 2 pairs in her Christmas package. I thought you might need them. For German winters, M.A. Von Hartmann held the gloves as if made of something precious. I cannot accept. You can, and you will. Because when you wear them in Germany, you'll remember that enemies can become something else if we choose it, if we work for it, if we refuse to let hate have the final word. He folded the gloves carefully, placed them in his breast pocket over his heart where he kept Hans's photograph. Will you tend the tree after I'm gone? I will. And when you go to Germany, will you visit my sister Greta, make sure she's well? I will. Thank you. And when you bring your parents to America, when not, if tell them their daughter honors them, that their choice to send her to safety was not in vain. They stood together beneath the oak tree, 2 people who had every reason to hate each other, who had found something unexpected in the aftermath. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. And understanding was a foundation strong enough to build on. The next morning, von Hartmann boarded a ship bound for Bremen. Maggie stood on the dock where she had first seen him 8 months earlier. He raised his hand in farewell. She raised hers. The ship pulled away, disappeared into morning haze. And Maggie turned toward her own uncertain future. 20 years passed like water through fingers. 1966, November. A cold afternoon in Ohio. Maggie stood in her office at Ohio State University. She was 49 now, professor of German literature and history, published author of 2 books on post-war reconciliation. Respected scholar, she had returned from Germany in spring of '47 with her parents, had helped them rebuild lives in Cleveland, had built her own life in academia. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, German postmark, handwriting she recognized instantly. Dear Miss Albrecht, I will be in the United States in late November for official consultations regarding NATO and West German defense integration. I wonder if you might spare time to see an old acquaintance. I would very much like that. Respectfully, Friedrich von Hartmann. Maggie wrote back the same day. Yes, please, come. He arrived 3 weeks later. Older 73, now hair completely white, walking with a pronounced limp from arthritis. But his eyes were the same. They met in a coffee shop near campus. Talked for 3 hours about his work rebuilding the German military on democratic principles, about her research about ordinary things. Then von Hartmann withdrew an envelope. Old, worn from handling. I found this last year in my sister's belongings after she passed. She had kept it hidden, never told me it existed. Inside a letter, December 1944, a child's careful handwriting. Dear Papa, the war will end someday. I know it will. Everyone says it won't, but I think it will. And when it ends, what will you do? Will you be angry at everyone forever, or will you try to be happy again? I think you should try to be happy. Being angry takes too much energy and you're already tired all the time. I love you very much. I hope you come home soon. Love, Hans. Maggie read it twice, vision blurring, handed it back carefully. I wrote a reply, von Hartmann said quietly. 22 years too late. Told him I would honor good people, people who taught me that humanity survives even war. People like you. Her eyes burned. I'm not good. I hated you for so long. For understandable reason. For wrong reason. Nathaniel wasn't even killed by your guns. He was killed by war. I am part of that war. The distinction is smaller than you think. They sat in silence. Then Maggie said, would you like to visit Nathaniel's grave? I finally went. 3 years ago. It took me that long. I'd like to go again. And I think it would mean something if you came. Von Hartmann nodded. I would be honored. 2 days later, they stood in a military cemetery outside Pittsburgh. Row after row of white marble markers, all identical, all equal in death. Nathaniel's grave was in section 7, row 12, marker 48. Simple, clean, name, rank, dates. Von Hartmann laid flowers at the base, white roses with small American and German flags woven together with wire. Maggie knelt, touched the cold marble. I'm sorry I blamed you for so long. Sorry I needed someone to hate. You didn't deserve that burden, but I'm glad I met you anyway, because you taught me something I wouldn't have learned otherwise. That the enemy is never simple, never just evil, always human, always carrying their own grief, and that understanding that doesn't excuse anything, but it makes peace possible, makes moving forward possible. They stayed until the sun began to set. On the drive back, von Hartmann asked if they might stop at Fort Hunt. It was a National Historic Site now, preserved, open for tours on weekends. They walked the grounds in fading light, past buildings that had housed prisoners and guards, past the administration building, past the chapel, and past the oak tree. It was massive, 21 years old, trunk thick as a barrel, branches spreading 50 feet, leaves turned gold with autumn. A plaque at its base planted by General Friedrich von Hartmann, POW, 1945, tended by Margaret Albrecht, translator, in memory of growth from ruins. Von Hartmann pressed his palm against the bark. It lived. They do, Maggie said, if you give them time, if you tend them, if you don't give up on them. I never thought I would see it again. Neither did I. They stood beneath the spreading branches as darkness fell. 21 more years passed. 1987, early December. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Friedrich von Hartmann had died, 94 years old, peacefully in his sleep at his home in Bonn. The funeral would be at Arlington National Cemetery, special permission granted for a German officer who had spent his post-war life building bridges. Maggie attended. She was asked to speak. She stood at the podium, looked at the small gathering at the casket draped in both German and American flags. I met Friedrich von Hartmann on December 3, 1945. I hated him. I had every reason to hate him. He represented everything I had lost, everything taken from me by war. Her voice was steady. But hatred is easy. It asks nothing of us except that we remain small, that we refuse complexity, that we insist the world is simple. Friedrich von Hartmann taught me that the world is not simple, that good men can serve evil causes, that guilt and innocence often coexist, that the only way to honor the dead is to give the living a chance to be better than we were. She paused. General von Hartmann established a scholarship fund in 1950. I only learned this after his death. 243 students have been funded over 37 years. Children of former prisoners, children of guards, children of soldiers from both sides, German and American and British and French and Russian, all studying peace, conflict resolution, international law, human rights. He never took credit, never announced it publicly, simply did it, because he understood that the only response to having caused death is to nurture life. The only response to having destroyed is to build. The only response to having served lies is to live truth. Maggie looked at the casket. Rest well, Friedrich. You earned it. You carried your grief with dignity. You chose redemption over despair. You planted trees that will outlive us all. And you taught me the hardest lesson, that forgiveness is not feeling. It is work. It is choosing every day to see the humanity in the enemy. To build bridges instead of walls. To plant trees instead of graves. Thank you. For everything, for teaching me what strength really looks like. The service ended, the casket was lowered, rifles fired a salute, a bugler played taps. Maggie stood as others departed, until one person remained, a young woman, mid-20s. She approached carefully. Professor Albrecht, I'm Anna Caldwell. My great-grandmother was Eleanor Caldwell, the woman who gave General von Hartmann dinner in Iowa in '45. She told me the story before she died. Maggie smiled. I was there. Your great-grandmother was extraordinary. She said the same about you, about both of you. Anna paused. General von Hartmann funded my education. I didn't know until after he died I'm getting my doctorate in international law, specializing in war crimes tribunals and transitional justice. Because of him, because of what he taught my family about choosing the future over the past. Maggie took her hand. He would have been proud. I hope so. I'm trying to do work that makes the hard things possible, that helps societies move forward after atrocity. That was his life's work too. They stood together, 3 generations removed from the war that had broken the world. 3 days later, Maggie returned to Fort Hunt one final time. The oak tree stood enormous, 42 years old, trunk so thick she could not encircle it with her arms. Branches spreading in every direction, strong, permanent, enduring. A new plaque had been placed at its base, recently. In memory of General Friedrich von Hartmann, 1893-1987. Planted this oak December 10, 1945, during his captivity as a prisoner of war. Tended by Margaret Albrecht. May this tree stand as testament that even in darkness some choose to plant seeds. In memory of all those lost, Nathaniel Albrecht, Hans von Hartmann, David Caldwell, Thomas Grayson returned safely 1946, and millions more whose names we carry. May we learn, may we choose better, may we build peace that lasts. Maggie stood beneath the spreading branches, touched the rough bark, felt the solid reality of it. 42 years ago, a German general had planted a small sapling in enemy soil, had chosen creation over destruction. Had insisted quietly and without fanfare that growth was possible even in captivity, even in defeat, even when everything seemed broken. And here it stood, proof that small acts matter, that choices compound, that what we plant grows beyond us. Maggie closed her eyes, felt winter sun on her face, heard wind moving through branches, and she understood finally what von Hartmann had known all along. The enemy is not the person across the battlefield. The enemy is the belief that people can be neatly divided into good and evil. War ends when we stop seeing enemies and start seeing humans. When we stop building walls and start planting trees. When we choose the future over the past. When we decide that mercy is strength, not weakness. When we understand that the truest power doesn't need to shout. The tree would remain, long after she was gone. Long after everyone who remembered the war was gone. Standing as testimony. That even in the darkest times, even in the midst of hatred and killing and the machinery of war, some people chose to plant seeds instead of graves. Chose to create instead of destroy, chose tomorrow over yesterday, chose hope over hate. And in that choice found the only victory that truly matters. The victory of remaining human, even when the world demands we become monsters, especially then.